Welcome to our first presentation of this technical track. First presentation's Practical WebAuthn, what you need to know. It's being presented by some good folks at Yubico. We're going to have here present Karen Larson, who's the Senior Director of Integration from Yubico, and remote we are going to have Scott Truger, who's a Senior Solutions Architect, also from Yubico. So Karen, if you want to take from here, thank you. Oh, and just a reminder to everybody, reminding the folks online that you can ask questions through the event site, but the people locally, you can also do that, and you can also use the C-Event tool to submit your questions, which, if we have time, we'll take at the end.
Yep. All right. So just really quickly, who we are. I'm the Senior Director for the Strategic Integrations team and program at Yubico. And I have with me Scott Truger, who is a Senior Solution Architect on my team. What we get the privilege of doing is working with all of the different Yubico partners. And we've spent some extensive time talking about WebAuthn over the last 2-3 years. And what we'd like to do is impart with you some of the lessons learned, some of the areas that we see being most sticky for people when they're trying to roll out WebAuthn in their environments. When we put together the abstract for this presentation, we thought we were going to have like an hour to 50 minutes, so we've had to shrunk the content down quite a bit. It's pretty dense, but please stick with us. There's a lot of information here to cover, and if you have any questions that come up, I'll be here for the rest of the conference. Please find me in the halls. What I love about some of these smaller conferences, you get to have a lot of great conversation with people, so feel free to track me down, and we're happy to discuss any topics as they come up. Yep. Will the slides be posted anymore? You know, I don't know, honestly. Yep. Yeah.
Pretty sure the slides will be posted and available to all attendees.
There you go.
As well as, I believe, the recorded sessions.
Yep. So we're going to be starting with just a quick overview of what FIDO2 is. FIDO2 is a couple of different standards that get combined to be able to support things like passwordless authentication and phishing-resistant types of authentication methods. There's 2 key standards that are part of this. One is WebAuthn. That is on the server-to-client side. The second standard that's part of this as well is called CTAP1 or CTAP2, and that is on the client-to-authenticator side. So these 2 pieces together combine to form FIDO2. Depending upon who you're talking to, how they're talking to you, you might hear this referred under some different names. So just be a little careful. It's all the same standard sets. The important part to remember here is that there's 3 different pieces to this puzzle. This isn't just a standard client to backend service. You also have that authenticator piece in here, and that becomes pretty key. The way that FIDO2 was designed is to support things via the client or platform. So this could be either at the OS level, it could be the browser level, it could be something like a native application. But for the FIDO2 standard to work, that client piece has to support FIDO2, as does your backend service and the authenticator via CTAP. So hopefully everybody's with me so far. Good. Okay. So one of the questions that my team gets a lot is where you can use FIDO, and the answer to that can be a little elusive. You know, we like to talk as an industry about this like great passwordless future and how tomorrow you could go back to your enterprises and flip a switch and everybody would be on passwordless and everything would be rainbows and unicorns and goodness, and you know, phishing would be a thing of the past, and that's not quite the reality that we're in yet. What people forget sometimes is the WebAuthn is still a relatively new standard. It was ratified in March of 2019. And this means that there's still some time and still some gaps in terms of platform support, platform rollout. You know, the good news about that is that all of the kind of major tech companies are behind the standard and have committed to rolling out the standard, but where they are in that process varies. So when you're thinking about rolling out passwordless in your organizations, one of the first steps you need to take is to figure out where your users are and making sure you're rolling out security that will meet them where they are on the devices, platforms, applications that they are using most commonly. One of the biggest mistakes that we see at Yubico is where people have not done that step and they have made assumptions about what can be supported. And that's where things start to break down. That's where things start to get a little tricky. So make sure that you're starting with that audit step first when you're planning out your FIDO2 implementation and rollout. All right. So Scott is going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into some of these authentication components. There we go.
Let's dig in. So there are three main components that a relying party has control of during the authentication kind of flow, right? So these are the three levers that you get to push and pull that will impact the user experience. So you need to understand how these three components work with each other and interact, and how that's going to impact the end user at the end. So that way you know what your users are going to go through during an authentication event, right? So first one up, user presence, also known as UP. Pretty straightforward. You're verifying that someone is there, right? Something is present. They're going to touch the blinking FIDO authenticator, right? Touch it, boom. That satisfies your UV, right? Next up, user verification, also known as UV. This is going to be entering a PIN or a biometric gesture, right? So you're verifying that a specific person is at the other end of that authentication event, right? You need to know what that PIN is, or you need to have that fingerprint that's going to match with a biometric gesture to satisfy a user verification requirement. As a relying party, you do get to pull those levers, right? So the settings for this are, you can set it to discourage, preferred, which means that if the FIDO authenticator is capable of user verification, it will then present the user with a UV challenge, or you can set it to required. If you do not set this as a relying party, it will default to preferred. So if the FIDO authenticator is capable, then you'll get it. Third item, discoverable credential. This is formerly known as resident credentials. This saves a little bit of information on the authenticator, and this enables a user nameless flow, and that's coming up on later slides. So what you get to push and pull on this one is true or false, right? Do you want discoverable credential? Do you not want it? And if you don't define it, then it just defaults to false. So those are the three main components that you get to package up and kind of push together and kind of manipulate the authentication flow and how those impact the user experience. So really digging in and understanding what those are is a big key.
That is
Next slide.
And the other piece to that is also understanding what those defaults are, and that those defaults might be different on different platforms too. So just some quick notes that Scott will cover here.
Oh, there should be the common authentication flows slide first.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
Yes. All right, so now we got the three main components with the previous slide. This is how you package them together, right? So these are the common packages that we see, the common authentication flows. So standard, everyone loves it, two-factor authentication. The user enters, types their username, types their password. They get prompted for a security key. They'll touch it. That's user presence, right? It's blinking, touch it, UP, there's someone present, and that's your two-factor flow. The second option is multi-factor. So I'm gonna type my username, and then I'm gonna go prompted for a FIDO authenticator. Maybe I'll insert my security key, and I'm gonna type my PIN. So now you got your user presence and your user verification by typing in your PIN. The third common flow is multi-factor with no username, right? So the authentication event, it's prompted for a security key, FIDO authenticator, plug in my security key. Maybe I'll do a biometric gesture if it's a FIDO authenticator, or I'll type in my PIN to satisfy my user verification, right? So those controls that you set as a relying party is that I want user verification to required, and I also want a discoverable credential, right? So that way there's no username. And this is gonna be the simplest flow for an end user for authentication. So there are other flows possible, right, based on how you package up these events and what you want and what kind of insurance level you want to meet for your service, right? So you could do a strong single factor authentication, but these are the three common that we've seen with our partners and in the wild.
Okay, now we can move forward. quick notes on.
All right.
Yeah.
Quick notes on UV, yes. So there's lots of discussion, questions, comments, I don't know about lots, but it's frequent around user verification, right? So we wanted to just touch on these quick points, right? This isn't exhaustive about UV, but we wanted to get these out there. So PIN requirement, biometric gesture, it is set for the entire authenticator. It is not set for each credential. As a relying party, you don't get to control that PIN on the credential that when it's registered, right? So a successful user verification event for an end user, right, unlocks their authenticator, so then it can do operations on the credentials, right? So it's one PIN to rule all of those credentials, which folds right into the next one. The minimum requirement is a PIN for user verification, right? So an unsuccessful biometric user verification will fall back to a PIN. And to enroll a fingerprint on a FIDO authenticator that has biometrics, right, you have to set a PIN first before you can then enroll your fingerprints. So minimum requirement, you're always gonna end up with a PIN. Users of a security key for user verification, if you're using your user verification flows, there's always gonna be a PIN involved. There's no assurance step up, right? So as a relying party, I'm deploying like, okay, let's deploy second factor flow, right? I'm setting UV to discouraged. I do not want a PIN in my flow event, right? So users are gonna register those credentials. 18 months later, I'm like, okay, let's, users ask for multi-factor authentication. Based on the previous slides, I can just set the UV flag to required, boom, and UV will pop up. That will fail for credentials that were registered without user verification. It's because you're upping the assurance level of that credential, right? So it's created without a PIN, and now you're saying, I want a PIN for authentication. That will actually fail. So you're gonna have to ask your users to re-register all those credentials that were not registered with UV. So it can be a sticking point. You really need to plan, you know, are you just gonna forever have second factor? Are you gonna maybe do UV, you know, required in one of those flows later on? Do we wanna have them register with user verification? That way we can up that later on in the flow. You really need to plan out on long game, or else you may be in a re-registration kind of event for your users going forward, right? So to help with that above that scenario, it's fun. Browsers and clients have adopted some extra logic, right? And this is something as a relying party you need to be aware of, because it impacts the user experience during registering a credential, right? So if a PIN is set on the authenticator, right, so it is capable of doing user verification, and a creation request comes in, the user will always get verified, right? The user verification flag will be set to true, regardless of what you as a relying party has asked for. You could set it to discouraged, but if your user's authenticator has a PIN set, they will be asked to enter their PIN, right? If there's no PIN set, it will act as you expect it to as a relying party. If I set UV discouraged, it goes through. There's no PIN on the authenticator, they're not going to get prompted, right? So that may cause a little bit of friction because, so let's say on your service, you have your instructions for enrolling. I'm doing UV discouraged in the back end. So my instructions are go to the site, register your authenticator, and then it's, you know, go through 1, 2, 3, now you're registered. Your users are going to come back and say, I was prompted for a PIN. What is this PIN? Can you please tell me what my PIN is? And that's not part of your flow. Well, you need to be aware that if a PIN was set by a different service on their authenticator, it may enter your flow during a registration event. So it gets a little complicated. Again, just be aware that it's happening, test it out, and make sure, you know, for your help and support articles, it's there. And because we mentioned it, PIN, it usually comes up something about passwords. As a PIN, the same as a password, I could be done very fast and just say no. A PIN is not a password. As I mentioned before, right, the PIN unlocks that security key, so it can do its, it can perform its role across those credentials, right? So that PIN is stored locally on the FIDO authenticator. It's never transmitted across the network, right? And because it's never transmitted and it's local to device, it doesn't need the same security requirements as a password, right? So you don't need all these complexity and whatnot. Currently in the FIDO standard, the PIN requirements is length of 4, and which is totally awesome because it's just local, right? We don't need all these complexity and length and all the restrictions for the PINs because it is not a password.
Okay. So hopefully everybody's staying with us so far. It's a lot of information, but we'll get through it. One of the concepts that FIDO 2 does introduce is this concept of attestation. And I think you hear this term a lot, particularly in the security identity space. It's not always clear exactly what that means. Like I was in a little bit of a haze for the first couple months I was working at Yubico. Kept hearing people say attestation, attestation, like it was the best thing since sliced bread, and I did not know what they were talking about. So just to break that down a little bit, this is really a way to know your device manufacturer, like KYADM, for people that are familiar with like know your payee or know your customer. This is a way that you can know that your device is manufactured by an authorized and a real device as part of the authentication event. What this allows you to do is a couple of different things. What we do at Yubico is we put a certificate on all of our security keys that will attest, and that's where the attestation piece comes in, to the fact that it's a device that we have made, that it's an authentic Yubico device. What you can then do is verify that certificate as part of the authentication event. The other thing that this allows you to do is to do things like filtering. So if you want to allow only certain types of authenticators, you can use this attestation event to help you do that. So this can be a key concept, but I just want people to be clear on what we're actually talking about here. And then to make it even more confusing, there's something called the attestation abject. Now this gets created when you do a creation event for a credential on a FIDO 2 authenticator. And as a relying party, the person that's requesting that, you'll get back this big data object. Just a word of caution, please save this. You only get this once. You cannot go back and query for this later or have your user regenerate this object. So just to be on the safe side, please save that as part of your process. The reason for that is that there's some additional information that comes as part of this attestation object. So this contains things like UV state, which can help you as a relying party if you're figuring out, UX flows. It also contains information on the attestation certificate so that you can do reporting on what types of keys are being registered, which can be critical in certain types of environments, or you may want to restrict the types of keys. And it also contains something called the AA GUID for that particular FIDO authenticator. AA GUID is an identifier that gets issued. We register that with FIDO. And what that tells you is what type of device this was. The attestation certificate will just tell you that like Yubico made it. What the AA GUID will tell you is what kind of series of authenticator you're looking at as part of that device thing. What common uses are for this are to be able to block certain types of authenticators via AA GUID. You can also block certain manufacturers or allow certain manufacturers if you need to do that for compliance reasons as part of your environment. You can understand UV, and then you can also report back on what types of authenticators are being used in your environment. But just remember, the big takeaway, you only get one chance to save that, so please save it. Okay. And then we get to the tricky concept of domains. So this is just to map out kind of in a typical environment some of the domains that you may encounter. Like most companies will have some kind of common primary domain that they are either rerouting traffic to or using as their primary domain for most of their internal or external functions. So in this example, we just have the generic mycompany.com domain. That's our top level domain for our company. But typically, you have subdomains as well, and those could be things like account, they could be like help.mycompany.com, could be like a security domain, or you may want to enforce like step-up privileges to access information that's part of that domain set. And then you might also be dealing with things like international domains, where the suffix on the domain is a little bit different. The tricky part with this for WebAuthn, and we've run into this in a couple places, so just to let you all know here today, is that you really need to be careful where you are requesting that create event coming from for your registration of the credential for FIDO2. What happens is, as a relying party, that domain will get sent to the credential itself, and then there's a tie that gets created between the domain that the relying party has called from and where the credential is being created. So when you do a lookup for that credential, that's the piece of information that needs to match for that credential to be valid and for the client to see it and say, yep, you've registered with mycompany.com and here's your credential for that domain. Where this gets tricky though is especially if you have like more complex websites, maybe you're running like a service desk system, things like that. You may want to have one credential that is the same for like all those different systems. So if you've done an awesome job of federating, hopefully people have the same ID no matter what systems they're going to in your company. However, those systems may be under different domains, and that's where this gets a little tricky. So there's a couple different options here. One is to think ahead, and this is where a little planning is definitely required, where you may want to set up a domain that's something like login.mycompany.com to facilitate all those requests, and then make sure that you're redirecting any login traffic to that particular domain. There is another option that's part of the spec where you can use subdomains as part of the app ID extension. But in order to do that, you have to know what subdomains you want to register to that primary domain when you create the credential. So what that means is if your marketing department comes up with some brilliant idea and they want a separate subdomain, you can't register that. So be a little careful. We've seen a few people get in some trouble here. And then just to recap a little bit, the best thing to do here is to make sure you're federating, that you have that single point of authentication. The other piece is to make sure that you are enforcing one common domain. That's kind of recommended practice. The other option is to do a credential per site, and that would mean that all your users will have to register with each of those different domains. So just be careful. Okay, so our top recommendations in 20 minutes or less for implementing FIDO are, one is to make sure that you've done that audit of your users' devices and applications that they use to make sure that they will all be compatible with FIDO2. Two is to make sure that you are pre-planning for your user experience. What do you want that to look like? Which of those flags that Scott talked about makes sense to add? And then three is to make sure you test. And you want to test across different devices, different clients, as well as different applications. So make sure you're trying all of that stuff out before you roll it out to your user base. And then the last step is to make sure you're communicating with your users. FIDO introduces some extra steps. It can also introduce a totally different authentication experience. So you want to make sure that you're communicating that with your user base. I think that is all we have. I don't know if we have time for questions or not. Is that...
We had one question online, which John
Mr.
Bradley
Bradley's
from
taking care
Yubico
of. Okay.
is currently answering for us
Nice.
kindly. We've more or less run out of time. We have 5 minutes in between sessions. If anyone has a burning question they'd like to ask publicly, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, thank you very much for presenting, and I'm sure the speakers will be available for questions if you want to approach them afterwards as well. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Scott.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.